underway, then. Good evening. Welcome to our third iteration of Sustainable Development Workshop sponsored by the League of Women Voters. My name is Matt Pennington. I am a consultant with Downstream Strategies. We are based out of Morgantown, West Virginia. And with me is Brennan Williams, community program planner with Downstream Strategies. And this webinar series came about from a report that we have worked on in Southwest Pennsylvania, discussing advancing projects in Southwest Pennsylvania that in light of some of the gas and natural resources industry. So looking for different pathways, identifying way stations and obstacles that might come along the way as some of the Reimagine Appalachia groups begin to realize and develop their projects further. We like to look at this series of webinars and workshops as sort of a summit to sustainability. As you see your vision and start to realize that you'll encounter a number of different routes that you can take along the way. And mountain climbers that have a number of different routes usually navigate this through a series of pitches where they're very skilled and have a very clear understanding of what skills they need during each individual part of scaling this mountain to sustainability. And it calls upon a number of different skills and strengths from your feet, arms, legs, every part of your body to kind of get up this mountaintop. We like this analogy for development projects as a whole because no matter what you do, there's always a little bit something different, a little nuance to the craft, so to speak. And so we like to walk people through this sort of mountain climbing 101. And the first iteration we had was under a pre-development planning. Last time we talked about project financing in pitch 6. And with that, we had some really wonderful folks from the Progress Fund and the Just Transition Fund to talk about grants as well as loans, or what from organizations known as Community Development of Financial Institutions, or CDFIs. But tonight we're going to be focusing on navigating bureaucracy. And with us tonight, we have some wonderful folks as well. Meagan Niebler, who's the Community Democracy Program Manager at Fair Shake Environmental Legal Services. From the same organization, we have Tim Fitchett, a staff attorney with the same organization, and Jason Kikel, Director of Regulatory Research for Cannabiz Media. And they're going to be sharing some of their knowledge, wisdom, and experiences that they've encountered navigating the bureaucratic systems through different projects and programs over their careers. So don't adjust your screens. I left this blank because for me, it was when bureaucracy was the topic for tonight. It was, how do you describe something that's all around you? It's like describing air to someone else sitting right next to you as you breathe in. Because if you work in this field long enough, chances are you have encountered some level of bureaucracy at one point or another. And so it's not just describing air, or maybe even describing water to a fish, if you were a fish. So, how does one talk about something that you're so knee deep in every day to day? So I think with this, I wanted to really take a step back and kind of go over how long this bureaucracy has been with us. And so this is a Greek story of Theseus. And Theseus and his father had a disagreement, so to speak. And as retribution for this disagreement, the king sort of has required these tributes be dedicated to this beast that lives inside this labyrinth, right? And so Theseus saying that every year it was unfair to dedicate these tributes to this beast for it to survive from his own kingdom, decided that he himself was going to be one of these tributes. And with that, he entered into the labyrinth, or he was going to enter into the labyrinth, save the other tributes of that year, and escape from the beast. And along the way, he met the daughter, Ariadne, of the king that required these tributes. And they of course fell in love, and she was worried of Theseus entering into this labyrinth, because once you got into this labyrinth, you really couldn't navigate your way out. And so she gave Theseus this red piece of thread to navigate into the labyrinth. And when Theseus entered the center of the labyrinth, he was able to slay this beast, this monster, and rescue those tributes from that year, and thus sort of overcoming this first sort of layer of bureaucracy, this big gargantuan beast, so to speak, that they essentially fought against. And I think it's a nice story because they used red yarn to navigate his way out, which we kind of later learned that red yarn later became what's known as red tape, which is sort of the nice way we like to think about bureaucracy sometimes, this paperwork, this red tape that gets in our way of why we can or cannot do projects. The red tape was later used by the Holy Roman Emperor to classify documents as very important. So it was a way for organization inside the Holy Roman Empire as they were expanding outward, and a symbol of maturing or growing organizations. So what is bureaucracy, though, in terms of where we are in the United States and in 2022? Well, I like to think about bureaucracy as this structure that connects principles with actions, right? So, and I like to use this analogy here of this jungle gym, right? The jungle gym is the structure, right? But the principle behind the jungle gym is fun, right? Or play, right? And it connects everyone who wants to play on it, right? It is how we communicate inside of this structure. It's how we win the game. We set the rules. We all are a part of it, whether for it, against it, whatever have you, it exists, right? And so, let's see here. Thank you. When I think about something along policies or principles of ideas, a great bit of time in my work was through the Clean Water Act, which as a whole is a great guiding principle, which promises every American citizen clean water to swim in, clean water to drink from, and clean water to fish in. And that is the promise that the government, the United States government, makes to us as citizens. But how do you achieve that, right? How do you get there? Well, once the Congress and president signs off on these acts, it's up to some of these regulatory authorities to really start to put that principle into action, right? And so we have regulatory mechanisms through permitting and, inspections and maintenance and monitoring, things along that nature, which basically fulfills that promise to the American people, that principle, right? So that is that layer of bureaucracy as it pertains to the Clean Water Act. And so we think about different types of praxis, right? This Greek word, again, meaning to rule, strength, right? Or power, right? It's the authority. And so we think of an aristocracy from Aristotle, where these great minds ruled over, all the decisions. And then we look at democracy here in America, where it's the rule of many, right? The rule of everyone. Everyone has a voice in democracy. And then we think about, our gentleman on the right here, which is, I love this picture because it really is the ruling from a desk, right? If you look at bureau as being French for small desk. So this bureaucracy is ruling from an office, ruling from a desk. And this picture is great because this gentleman he's faceless, he's nameless. He doesn't even have a name on his nameplate, which is kind of resembling the impersonality that goes along with bureaucracy. If we hang with democracy in America for just a bit, we look at an excerpt from chapter 56 from the Tocqueville book, and it talks about how Americans living in this democratic age have this taste for independence, but we're naturally impatient for regulation. We don't really like it, but we have it all around us, like I said. And one reason is because we need it. We need to have this democracy. It's this necessary evil that exists because, as we learned in the Federalist Papers from James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, talking about if men were angels, no government would be necessary, right? But if the government was ruled by angels, right, then we wouldn't need controls over that government. So what they're saying here is that first and foremost, in a government that's administered by men or people over people, you need to enable the government to control the governed, which is through laws and regulations and rules, but be conscious and hope that the government controls itself at the same time. And we have this image of sort of this monster again inside of that labyrinth, right? And if you cut or you slay this beast in some capacity, it'll just regrow another head, right? So if you fight against bureaucracy, sometimes it'll get worse. It'll get angry and have another head that you have to fight with, and you create another layer of this type of this monster, so to speak. So it really is something of our own creation. And it's not just federal government or state or local government, it exists in large corporations. So if you look at some of the biggest tech firms in the country and arguably the world, is that a lot of the big three started in a garage. And there wasn't really much need for high levels of bureaucracy when you're just talking to Steve or Jeff or Sergey over there and wanting to know, hey, how do we do this? Oh, hey, how do we do that? So small startups can move extremely fast and produce high levels of efficiency. But once that startup starts to mature and grow, there's layers of bureaucracy. Just think about the last time you tried to maybe return something to Amazon. It's how much bureaucracy do you think it exists to be able to mail something back and return it from somewhere else in the United States? Or the security codes now that you have to go in just to access your Gmail account or any search on Google or access your iPhone. Now you have to have passwords and face recognition and thumbprinting. So all these securities and different layers of rules and regulations get added as an organization starts to mature. And really, it doesn't even end there. It even exists within our own family structures. So this is me with my two daughters and my family structure. And I'm going to tell you a quick story of bureaucracy in its simplest form about this hairbrush. So for a long time, this hairbrush was a very sought after object in our household, but it kept going missing. And we weren't really sure how to make this situation better. How do we remedy? And so we came together for a family meeting to talk about, hey, where does the hairbrush keep going? How can we bring it back? Well, we had a number of suggestions. Someone said, hey, what if we had a sign out sheet and as soon as you borrow the hairbrush, you write it down? Or maybe it was, hey, what if we even, attach some sort of chain to this so we knew exactly where the hairbrush was at all time? And I started thinking, I was like, what if we just put the hairbrush back where it belonged afterwards, right? And that is really bureaucracy in its simplest form, is that sometimes we just aren't able to get where we need to be. And it's a failure to trust that the person can do the right thing. And so we have to enable all these different rules and requirements in an effort to make something better. And I skipped ahead here, but I often laugh at some of the simplest forms of bureaucracy is a bathroom key at a gas station or the dreaded hall pass at a local school. I love the fact that this person is literally carrying or towing a trash can behind us, because, that's, I think, what we get most discouraged about in this bureaucracy is that it's not all bad, as we'll learn here in a minute from Max Weber, but in his ideas of bureaucracy, but it's simply the waste that occurs when you have these bureaucratic systems. And we often see the waste during times of emergency, because what gets accomplished during a time of emergency versus what gets accomplished from the normal day to day equals bureaucratic waste, right? And that's something we get challenged with, and accepting of that bureaucratic waste. If we think about how quickly vaccines were, approved by the FDA during COVID-19 versus how long maybe a drug manufacturing company might go through the FDA approval process. But in times of emergency, we're able to accomplish great things. And as I said, bureaucracy, it's a necessary evil. And one of the sort of founding thinkers about this bureaucracy was a German sociologist named Max Weber, and you can read about some of his work. But he had sort of these 6 principles of bureaucracy, and a hierarchy, or a sort of a rank and file, so to speak. Formal rules and regulations. This seems like a fine thing to have when you start to grow as an organization. Specialization, we think about like factory assembly lines in the automotive industry at the beginning, everyone doing a very specially organized task, very efficient. I mentioned impersonality earlier by the nameless bureaucrat that you saw. That's someone that, doesn't provide bias in making decisions within this system. Career development is, you want people who are there that want to grow, that want to be invested in the system, and have the best people working on this. And that was ultimately what Weber thought bureaucracy was that we had the best people doing these jobs all the time. And I think that's something to remember as we go forward with our presenters and talking about the layers of bureaucracy and the people who are making those decisions, and how to think through working with these folks as you move forward with your projects. So as I come back to the jungle gym here, I believe that there's a lot of creativity that you can do within the constraints of bureaucracy, the structure that exists. And as I'm really happy to have Meagan join us next from the Fair Shake Environmental Legal Services to talk about the different layers of bureaucracy. So Meagan, the screen is all yours.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Matt. That was great context for this super exciting and fun to talk about topic on a beautiful Thursday evening. So thank you. All right. So I am going to get my screen going. Are you able to see the PowerPoint?
Not yet, Nick. Oh, there we go.
Here we go. Okay. All right. Awesome. So hello, everybody. Again, my name is Meagan Niebler, and I'm excited to be here with my colleague, Tim Fitchett, as well. And we are with Fair Shake Environmental Legal Services. And we are here because we believe that all communities should have access to those tools of justice, and that really everybody deserves to have a place at the table to make decisions about their air and the water and the places that they live, work, and play. So real briefly, Fair Shake does this work by providing pro bono and sliding fee scale legal representation and counseling. I manage our community democracy program, which seeks to work kind of upriver to support a lot of amazing projects similar to the work that many of you are probably working on to proactively drive your visions. And then we also do legal services entrepreneurship, so mentorship for the next generation of attorneys in this field. So I am not an attorney. I have no legal training, but my attorney colleagues would always appreciate me making sure to share out this disclaimer that we are not here providing any legal advice, and this is not a lawyer-client relationship. So that being said, for the next couple minutes, Tim and myself are really going to be talking through what are the different layers of government, trying to figure out like who's who, so that when you care about this issue and you're passionate about it, kind of who is that person that you can go to, and where do the best levers exist that you can pull on to make that change. So I'm relatively new in this role. I started back in January, and in my role, kind of one of the main things I'm learning is around these different scopes of power, right? How are decisions made, and who holds the power to make what decisions? And so that's what we're going to start off thinking about, kind of who within our government system, within the bureaucracy, has the power to make decisions over those issues you care about. So we're going to start with an onion. I hate onions. I think they're the most disgusting food out there, especially these raw ones. But if you can fry them up and cut them up the right way and put a lot of batter on them and have the right dipping sauce, like I can make it work. I can eat that onion ring and be all right with it. And I kind of have started thinking about bureaucracy in much the same way, right? I hate a lot about it. A lot of it might not be delicious to eat. But kind of figuring out how to work with that onion of bureaucracy, you can kind of make it work for you. And so we're going to use this analogy to really talk about the different layers and how these different layers of government work together to move decisions, to kind of move ideas forward. And so to get started, I want everybody to pull out a piece of paper. Yes, thank you. I'm seeing some people move, so I appreciate you. So go ahead and pull out a piece of paper, get a pencil, and you're gonna kind of work along with me and make your own onion. So as you're making your onion, I want you to put yourself in the middle of that onion, right? So you're the very center, kind of where it started, the seed, and write your spark. Kind of what is that issue that you care deeply about? What is the thing that you're excited to change that brought you to a webinar on a beautiful Thursday evening about bureaucracy? And so as we continue, I want you to kind of keep that in the back of your mind. And we're going to keep thinking and referring back to that center spark as we talk, so that this can really, what I would encourage you to do is really think about how your spark in particular kind of resonates with these different layers. So what's the onion look like for you? And so we have multiple different layers of our decision-making bodies, right? We have our federal, our state, our county, and our municipality. So again, kind of take a second, go back to the onion in front of you and write down those places. And I know it might sound silly to write, your federal government is the United States, but bear with me. So go ahead and write down, the country you live in, the state you're in. It's exciting. I thought we just have Pennsylvania, but we have New Mexico as well, which is great. Your county, and then your city, your borough, your township, your town, that municipality, the most local place that you live in. All right, so let's start with our outermost layer, which is our federal layer. So the most outside of our onion, this is the federal government, right? That's our president, Congress, Senate, Supreme Court. And they are on the outside because kind of whatever rules and systems that they say, the policies that they create have to be followed by everybody else. So they are the outermost layer. They have decision-making over the things on the slide: money, taxes, the welfare of all citizens. They give funds and money to states to operate different programs. And they do some environmental permitting over those things that kind of really impact things across states, or kind of some of these bigger policies. So the important thing about the federal government is that for the most part, they kind of play an important role in keeping kind of the big picture, right? They're the ones who say, here's this big policy, and now states, you get to figure out how to make this come to life. So for the EPA, for example, right, the EPA plays a big role in keeping our environment clean, but really that heavy lifting that gets done by state and local governments. So looking at their onion and looking at the onion that you have in front of you right now, I'd love to hear how far away from your spark is that federal government? And please talk out loud, chime in. I love to hear other people's voices on webinars.
Megan, for me, it's pretty far away.
Pretty far away. You're probably not the only one. Yes. So
very rarely do I meet with any federal official about a flooding project in my community.
Yeah, totally. So because it's the federal layer is so big and so massive and so furthest away from where you are, it can be really hard to make impactful change, right? Not impossible. If this is your thing and you're passionate about making those federal changes, then amazing, right? We need you. But it's really hard to really kind of make tangible impacts on the spark that you care about. So our next layer that we're going to move to is our state. So as long as our state laws don't go or butt up against the federal laws, right, the most outer, our states are in charge of things like raising taxes, different license, conducting elections, setting up local governments, education, and then a couple that are really important for a lot of community development work, right? The implementation of those federal policies, supporting public health of citizens, transportation, and the regulation of industry. So again, kind of thinking about our environmental laws, the regulation of industry is some of the reasons that each state does things very differently, right? Because each state is saying, all right, federal government, I see your policy and here's how we're going to make it come to reality here in our state. So in Pennsylvania, for example, the state Department of Environmental Protection is the one who really issues a lot of our permits, gives approvals for a lot of different, environmental development sort of work. So next we have our county layer. And again, they have their certain rules and responsibilities and they can't go outside into the larger layers, right? So they are kind of within their realm of the onion. They do things like public health, county court, records, emergency management, public works, sheriff department. And then last, but definitely not least, is our municipalities. And here in Pennsylvania, we like to call them lots of different things like boroughs or townships or cities or towns. Our municipalities are in charge of things like parks and recreation, police, fire department, and sometimes they're in charge of things like transportation, community health. And across, no matter how big or small your area is, your local municipality can also decide how land and space can be used. Because they're the innermost layer, right? They also have to then follow the rules and policies and guidelines set forth by the county and by their state and by the federal government. So we have this wonderful onion, but you don't just grow an onion, right? Where do you grow an onion? It's got to be planted somewhere, right? So we have our dirt. The dirt is everything else that's going to influence the way that that onion grows. It's all of the other influences, the cultures, the norms, the traditions, right? The soil that onion is planted in influences the taste and flavor of it. And same with your local bureaucracy, right? Yes, you have this structure of how the bureaucracy is supposed to work, but what are the other things that influence that, right? Maybe it's, it's when town, for example, it's the car dealership is part of this soil that has a big influence over the way that local municipality works. In another town, it's the tradition of union jobs kind of continues to influence that bureaucracy. In another town, it's community cohesion and identity, right? And so all of those little things kind of really form together to create the soil that bureaucracy works within. So go ahead and pull out your onion again and take a look at your spark. And spend a couple minutes like really thinking through kind of within your spark, kind of where could you go? Kind of who has power, control, what layer of government do you think could influence the spark that you care about? And maybe it's the official bureaucracy, or maybe it's part of the soil that surrounds the bureaucracy where you live. So go ahead and take, a minute or so. And then I would love to hear from somebody kind of what this looks like for them, kind of what is their spark. And when they're thinking about their layers of bureaucracy that influence that spark, what is that looking like?
Megan, for projects that I've worked on for flooding, it was the soil around it was everyone else that was affected by it, and it just wasn't just the general property owners whose basements were had water in it or whose belongings were damaged, but it was other organizations too, like the school board, who had to cancel school like 2 days and make those up, and still had to make payments in certain areas, different events that had to get canceled because of it, that if that property was damaged, they couldn't have the community event there, and so it like really rippled out. So the soil, as soon as you started kind of digging into it, got deeper and richer, and it started to show that it wasn't just people in the floodplain, but it was the whole community. That was really, and so the spark was able to grow out a little bit and start to influence, because it wasn't just me saying that we needed to do something. It was everyone that kind of gathered and rallied around it.
Awesome. Great example. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Would anybody else like to talk about their bureaucratic onion?
I'll throw something in from New Mexico. Can you hear me?
Wonderful. Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Well, for class, we were supposed to write to some kind of representative about something we cared about. And mine is emergency kits for disasters, because we could have a devastating fire here. And even though we're in a severe drought, it's possible that we could have a flood. And the local fire chief has done a lot for having some emergency preparedness, or having cooling stations if it gets too hot, things like that. But the letters I have written don't get responses. And I told a friend about that recently, and she said, well, they're working for free. They can't respond to you. They don't have a salary. They don't have an office staff. So I'm not sure how I would push my emergency kits further. There's a lot of very poor people in our area too, in Sandoval County. And I just feel passionate about it, but yeah, I don't know. I just feel like I'm kind of barking in the wind. Anyway, I have mine ready, finally.
Well, that's fantastic. I mean, it's definitely a needed initiative, right, to make sure that people can stay safe in emergencies. So it's a great idea. And if it's okay with you, I'd love to circle back to this example in a couple minutes, and maybe as a group we can really think through, you tried one strategy, which is fantastic, and what are those other levers that you may be able to pull on, or somebody else you may be able to go to that can help move that idea forward.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for volunteering that. Okay, so we've all got our onion, right? Lots of different layers. The layers often work together to kind of move projects forward. So what does this look like on a local level? Let's think about kind of how, within your local municipality, things actually happen. So it starts with you, right? The citizens, the residents of your community, and all of that other onion dirt, right? All of the other influences and cultures and traditions and norms that you live in. So the type of municipality that you live in kind of dictates what different positions are called, and the power of the role. So we're going to talk in a little bit broader strokes, in a really simple image. So the power, again, kind of starts with you in your local bureaucracy. Kind of you vote to decide kind of who your representatives are, including who is on your city council, your commissioners, your mayors. And your government decides kind of what things are going to happen by passing ordinances or resolutions and approving the budget. Right. So these folks, the city councilors, if you have city councilors, or the commissioners or supervisors, they are the ones to, again, kind of say, like, here's the vision, here are what things are going to happen. This group also often oversees and creates boards and committees to help them do their jobs. And the boards and committees are really there to kind of show their expertise, to make recommendations to your city council members. And in some cases, a board may have final decision-making power over certain issues. Boards and commissions and committees like vary greatly from municipality to municipality. But some of these boards and committees hold a lot of power. And importantly, they're not elected positions, which means that often there's vacant spots that community members are able to apply for and be part of their local municipality to help make decisions and recommendations. So examples of these boards and committees are things like, park advisory boards, zoning and hearing boards, diversity, equity, inclusion committees, or tree or bike committees. So just kind of great ways to get involved and get engaged about there may be a committee or a board where you live that really kind of speaks to the spark that you hold. Okay, so now that your municipality kind of knows what direction it's going to go to, it's up to your executives, so your mayor or your manager, to kind of figure out how to put that idea into reality. So the mayor or manager is, they oversee different departments. They create the budget, they sign and approve ordinances and resolutions, and then delegate those to the right department. And the departments are the ones of saying, okay, how are we going to put this policy into action, right? What are the different things that we need to do to make sure that this ordinance or this local law can actually be implemented in everyday business in our community? And then we have our staff, which are incredible municipal staff who do the things, right? So we have part of our government who says kind of, here are the things we want to see happen. We have part of our government saying, here's how the things are going to happen. And then we have part of our government locally who do the things to make the things happen. And so we're going to pause here for a second again, and I want to give everybody some homework tonight. And that is to actually kind of go to your local municipality's website, okay? And spend some time kind of figuring out how to make a flow chart of who's who in your local municipality, right? Kind of what are the different positions called? What committees or boards do you have in your community? Which ones maybe have an open spot that maybe one day you'd be interested in joining? When do the different meetings happen? And then again, kind of go back to your spark, right? Where might it fit in within kind of how your local municipality is set up? And again, ways that you can kind of pull that lever, right? If it is emergency management, setup and systems, I would, maybe there's a board around, I'm trying to think, and I invite lots of folks as well to join in. If you can think of a board or committee that might be interested and kind of have some alignment in terms of what their goals are and what your spark is. And I'm not thinking of one on the top of my head, but I will also be quiet if anybody else can think of, if you've seen a local municipal board or committee or commission that might have some shared alignment with the idea of like emergency preparedness and the work that they're doing.
How about a planning commission?
What's that, Brennan?
How about a planning commission?
A planning commission, that's a great, yes, absolutely. So a planning commission, they really help set the tone and the tenure of where your local government is going to go. So that could be a great kind of foot in the door to go to the planning commission, listen to what they have to say. And then during the time that you can speak up during public comments, kind of share your idea and your passion and your spark. And that could be a way to get some momentum. So that all sounds great on a piece of paper, but how does this actually work to kind of move actual ideas forward? So we're going to, as a group, try to read a story together. And so in just a minute, I'm going to put a script up on our screen. And I am asking for 5 people who would be willing to help me play a part in our municipal play this evening. So I need 5 people, and all you need to do is read like a sentence or 2. You don't even have to be a good actor when you read it.
Okay, then I'll do it if you have, I'm not sure others will do it, so I'll do it from New Mexico.
Okay, so Eleni, you will be community. That will be your role. Heather, thank you. You will be city council. You got lots of power. You're city council this evening. Congratulations.
I'll join in too.
Awesome. Brennan, you will be committee. We can say planning committee for just to continue. Matt, did you unmute? The real Matt Pennington?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, great. You are now the mayor. Congratulations.
All right.
On your victory.
I accept my appointment.
We need one more.
I'll do it.
Awesome. Jason, you will be the Department of Public Health. And so what we're going to do is look at a very high speed, assuming everything is like the most well-run and open and transparent municipality you've ever seen, but just to kind of see the process in action. All right. So in just a moment, we're going to start and we're just going to run through this and read your line. And then at the end, we'll have a few minutes to kind of debrief and talk through what we heard and what that tells us. So Eleni, you will get us started with your community line.
Okay. So many of our kids have lead poisoning and peeling paint in their houses. There has to be a way for the city to do more to protect our kids from lead.
I just spoke with one of my community members, and they are super passionate about lead-safe housing. I think we can do more to make sure rentals are lead-safe. I will talk with our committees about what we can do to create new ordinances, laws, or resolution positions so about lead safety.
We just received an ask from City Council to recommend new ordinances for lead safety. After research, other communities have passed an ordinance requiring all landlords with units built before 1978 to provide a lead safe certification from a certified dust wipe technician prior to giving of a rental license or occupancy permit. It seems like something we can do, and I think could really help renters with children stay lead safe. We will recommend that this practice here too.
The committee recommended that we give a rental license to the landlord until the property is certified as lead safe. I will draft this ordinance and get more community feedback on this during the neighborhood block party.
Well, I don't know much about lead, but we do need to bring more good jobs to the area.
Great feedback. I will update this ordinance to include language that priority will go to local contractors. I will also talk with the mayor, who controls the budget, about paying for some training for local contractors to be certified in lead-safe practices.
2 weeks later.
During tonight's city council meeting, we will review and discuss the new lead-safe rental ordinance. We will also hear public comment.
I think this is great. We know that people who have lower incomes and people of color are more likely to get lead poisoning from their homes. I support this ordinance because it will keep my neighbors safe and healthy.
Thank you. We will update the draft to its final version and vote on it next council meeting.
2 weeks later.
Welcome everyone to the city council meeting. Last week, we reviewed and heard public comment on the lead-safe rental ordinance. After voting, it passes. Now, we send them to the mayor's office for their signature.
All right, good work, everybody. The lead safe rental ordinance has passed. I am signing and approving and sending this to the Department of Health to figure out how we're going to turn this ordinance into reality.
The lead safe rental ordinance passed, and it gave our department the power to write the policies about how this will actually roll out and work. Let's get to work.
6 months later.
I feel way more comfortable moving into a new apartment with my kids because I know there is not lead, dust, and paint, which could hurt them.
Yay! Amazing work to all the actors. Thank you all so much for reading that. This is obviously, an incredible municipality where this has happened. But I, would love to hear from your perspective, right? Kind of what happened to move this spark of an idea about lead safety to actually being a thing? Kind of what was the process that decision went through?
Well, there was a problem identification,
Hmm.
and they wanted to make it better.
There was community engagement at the block party or neighborhood party.
There was community engagement at the neighborhood block party. Absolutely. Was there any other aspects of community engagement that anybody else heard?
Approaching city council.
Yeah, so community members spoke up at that city council meeting as well.
Was it put in the newspaper?
Oh, not in our written story, but the agenda for that city council meeting
Would have been required, yeah.
could have been in that local newspaper. Yeah, great addition.
I thought that's what the 2 weeks later was. That's obviously the advertising period.
Yeah, y'all are too good. And also, one more thing is that this idea started with a community member. The community member was one of the ones to kind of bring this to their local city council person.
Oh, and also community member looking out for local jobs and economic development as well.
I think another thing that this story shows is that the more kind of brains with unique skills and experiences and perspectives that are at the table creating whatever that idea is and building up that idea, you're going to end up with a stronger resolution, right? It started with just kind of one idea and then was added to the certified lead safe dust swipes and then local contractors, right? So also bringing equity into this. So a lot of good ideas from public throughout this process.
And they looked at what other places did.
Yeah, that's a great observation. There's so much out there. So in a lot of times there's no need to start from scratch. There's some great resources that exist that you can borrow and add and edit and modify to make something work for the needs and vision of your community. Thank you. So kind of building off that, there are many non-legal levers, and Tim in a minute is going to start talking through some of the legal levers that we as citizens all have the ability to pull on. But, just some things to think about is to, look again where the power flows for your spark, kind of who holds the power and what do they care about. That looks like building relationships with people, which is time intensive and not kind of immediate payout often, and can sometimes be really frustrating. Eleni, like for example, when you don't hear back from people, but really taking the time to build those relationships is helpful.
You've already inspired me.
Good.
This stuff does go on, and I need to attend those things. Thank you.
Yeah, and I wish I think kind of you need to attend, and building community with others who share your spark can also be helpful, right? Because we're all just one person with a lot of other things on our plates. And so thinking through who can you build community with who's also interested in this issue, that you can kind of share that responsibility, that you can take bits of it that are exciting to you, and somebody else can take a bit of it that's exciting to them. And then together you're going to be so much more stronger as well. So going back to build community with others who share that spark. And then, just like you mentioned, right, observe the meetings too. So you can do this. A lot of municipalities will put their meetings on YouTube these days, which is great. I know for myself, it's really hard to get out of the house with 2 young kids in the evening. And so read agendas and observe meetings, and just think about like who talks, right? Who do they influence? What are the things that they're talking about, right? You can learn a lot about who holds the power just by observing those meetings. Make it easy for your representative. So like we mentioned earlier, there's a lot of fantastic resources out there that you can bring to them as like, hey, here's an example that worked in this other community. We need something like this here. So there's a couple websites on there, and us at Fair Shake are developing out some tools as well. And then again, you know, if there's not a committee that speaks, or if there's a big gap in terms of committees or boards that are present in your community, you know, advocate for that, right? If there needs to be an emergency preparedness committee, because, you know, you live in a high flood zone area, that might be a really valuable use of your municipality's support, is to make that thing come to life. So lastly, before I turn it over to Tim, I just want to share an example of kind of what's this looking like in action for our community democracy program. So we are working really closely with a community partner in Wellsville, Ohio, which is right on the border of Pennsylvania and is kind of sitting right next to, in this little tiny valley, right on the Ohio River. And the goal there is that community is going to determine what they want for their air and water and places. This town has a number of really large industry buildings in town. And so our partner really started his work by just showing up. So he would just go to city council meetings, you know, sit around, make his face known, make the presence known. And then after a couple meetings, he went up and introduced himself to the mayor and some other folks. And it's like, oh yeah, I've seen you around. That's great. Glad you're here, right? He was welcomed in because he took the time to show up. Mm-hmm. He then had a lot of conversations with community members just to learn what community wanted for their future. Listen to what folks got excited about, and then what they were annoyed with, what they were frustrated with, what they were apathetic about. And so through this, we heard soot and roads, tired of the black soot on everything and tired of our roads being torn up, right? He had these conversations and built relationship with the city administrators, as well as with the mayor, right? Like, what's going on and what are you frustrated with? Kind of, if you could wave a magic wand, what would that look like for you? Once we had this little spark of an idea, right? People are fed up with the soot in the roads. Then we were researching, then we're looking at, okay, what are the current ordinances and laws on the books around these things? What does that tell us? And from there, we're talking more with community members to dig in a little bit more to that, right? How are we going to change the soot? Like, we're frustrated with the soot. What do we want it to be, right? If we could wave our magic wand, would that look like more accountability? Would that look like things changing in terms of what's allowed or not allowed? Would that look like better tarps on trains that are coming in, right? So there's so many different possibilities, but coming together collaboratively to solve this problem, we know community is going to have the best ideas about how to solve this problem. So from there, we're going to be facilitating and co-writing some new ordinances with those community members, and then supporting them to take those to their city council members, to talk with the mayor about them, to show that like we can do this as a community because this is where we want, and this is what's important for our health and well-being. And then seeing what comes of that, right? It's always kind of an upward building spiral that once you get one thing going, it's like, okay, what's next? Because then people are excited because they can see like, you know, we were able to make that onion of bureaucracy work in this case. Yeah. So I'm excited to turn it over to Tim, and he has lots of amazing ideas about those legal levers. But this is my email and my phone number. So if there's ever a time that we can support the work that you're doing with our community democracy program, please don't hesitate to reach out, and would love to connect. Great. So thank you all, and I'll.
Thank you.
Oh, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, well, Tim gets set up. Meagan, thank you so much. And just to recap on some of your homework, I love the idea of sort of mapping out the inner workings of your local government, right? That it just kind of like dawned on me like circuitry of the spark, right? How does your idea, this LED light, really like pop, right? What are the connections that you need to make, not only with yourself, but with your local government and your community members? You know, where's the energy? Where's the power source? How does that need to be connected so that your idea starts to light up and catch fire, so to speak? And I really love the idea of pulling on these levers and switches, because it reminds me of some research I did on bureaucracy, and that it's really sometimes like a sumo wrestling match, and that, you know, you have two behemoths kind of going at it. In bureaucracy, the power of government is one of them, and your idea can be that too. And really using the levers, right? Leverage wrestling in this case is all about, you know, using the leverage to overtake your partner or your wrestling opponent. In this case, the bureaucracy, the government, whatever it would be, the permitting office, and how to challenge that. And so Tim's going to kind of walk us through some of the playbook or the technique and how to utilize this, to the levers to pull and how to pull them and when to pull them. So Tim, the screen is all yours.
Do you want me to keep sharing, Tim? Or do you have it? Oh, beautiful. Never mind. You're good.
Shoot, sorry, I was muted there. I didn't realize. Were you guys seeing? And now it's drawing something. I'm sorry, everybody. Okay, are you guys seeing the presentation? Not the
Yes.
presenter screen?
Yes.
All right, fantastic. I apologize for that. Technical difficulties in that. So I want to dive in and try and breeze through some of this stuff. So one of the big questions is sort of just why you need to act. And from a legal perspective, I just want to talk about that for half a second, because if you don't act, you're just going to deal with what other people are doing, right? If you're not actually acting on your own, you're just going to deal with the other people that are acting. So it can be really important to get in there and get your voice heard. And you know, government agencies can't be counted on to enforce all of the laws, sadly. We would like them to be able to do that, but they just generally don't have the manpower to do it. And so sometimes citizens have to step in to make sure that the laws are paid attention to. When an individual or a company puts in an application, a stressed, understaffed bureaucracy is going to assume that everything that they're putting down there is correct, right? But if you step in and you say, whoa, they didn't even tell you about the wetland that's right off of their property, then if you go and tell them that, then the department, the agency, whatever it might be, you're like, oh geez, yeah, they totally missed that. We're gonna have to reassess this. The other reason why you need to be able to make your voice heard is that decision makers can actually interpret laws in a lot of different ways. The law is not black and white. There's a lot of gray area, and making your voice heard might sway decision makers to decide the way that you would like them to. And the other really important reason that you need to act is that you can actually lose rights. And so if you don't act and somebody applies for a terrible permit and the DEP or the EPA isn't paying attention and issues that permit and nobody comments on it and nobody appeals it, then that permit is going to be in place forever. And you're not going to have that opportunity. There becomes certainty after a certain point. So you really have to be paying attention and doing and acting starting now all through the future. So there is a legal background that I just want to go over briefly of that's going to be behind every single decision that's made. There's going to be precedent, there's court cases that are going to be reviewed, there's going to be statutes and regulations, and then there are decision makers that are in place. And all of these can be affected in different ways, but they're all there right now. They form the background. They are that, you know, some of that dirt that Meagan was talking about, and they're all going to affect that outcome. And whether or not what you want to happen is going to happen. And so you really need to act now and continuously to make sure that the decision makers that are there are going to be aligned with your values, that they're going to decide in your favor, that they are going to be making ordinances, regulations, statutes that are in your favor, and even, you know, electing judges that are going to be potentially willing to bend the law or interpret the law the way that you would like them to. And so that's really the core of democracy, is to be there, paying attention, and making sure that the decision makers and the laws are what you want to see. So presidential court cases, I don't want to talk about them for a long time because they're difficult, they're long, they're expensive, they're tough to overturn. You can do some really great things. Pennsylvania Environmental Defense Fund recently bolstered Pennsylvanian citizens' rights to clean air, clean water through the Environmental Rights Amendment, which is a constitutional amendment here in PA. And they were able to give it some teeth and really help. It's going to help a lot. But their court cases lasted, I think, a decade or more. And that's taking it up from the trial level. It went up to the Supreme Court, back down, back up, back down, and then back up for a third time. So PEDF 3 was just issued a couple months ago. And hopefully that's the end of it, but probably not. So the things that are more likely in somewhat of a shorter term are statutes, regulations, and ordinances. And so it's really important to understand who is the regulator if you want to change these things. So there are statutes that are in place. Those are enacted by the state and the federal Congress. There are regulations that are implementing the statutes, and those are created by state and federal agencies. So Congress enacted the Clean Air Act. That's a federal statute. The state then enacted in Pennsylvania, the Air Pollution Control Act, which is a state statute. Then the EPA, which is a federal agency, enacted a bunch of regulations under the Clean Air Act. And then the Pennsylvania DEP enacted a bunch of state regulations under the Air Pollution Control Act. Then there are also ordinances that are on a much lower level of zoning and land use, and what can happen really in your community with the way that land is done. And that's going to be through local council members. And the problem is that if you're not talking to the right person, then your very valid points can fall on deaf ears because they're simply not the right person to hear that particular concern. At the state and federal level, you need to actually sponsor a bill. So you need a champion who's going to go and present that to the legislative body. That's lobbying. You go out and you tell them, hey, this is really important. Please do that. At the local level, which is sort of what the skit was before that Meagan presented, you can actually petition for ordinance changes, or it can be a little bit easier because the decision makers are people in your community directly. It becomes a little bit easier to kind of pressure them to make some of those changes. But there are also, in certain municipalities, you can actually just walk in with an ordinance and say, I want you to look at this. I think you should enact this. And it can make them have to make a decision or an on-the-record vote on your particular ordinance. So you can look up and perhaps your municipality has that. There are lots of different decision makers at all of these different points. There can be decision makers in the agencies. And so when somebody's applying for a permit, there's going to be a bunch of people in the agency, in the Department of Environmental Protection, in the Labor Relations Board, whatever it might be, that are looking at these applications and saying, do these follow the ordinance? And this is one of those spots where if you speak up, you can alert them to things that they may not be aware of, because obviously the applicant is going to paint it in the best light possible for them, right? But if it's not good for your community, then you want to step in and tell them why it's not. They can have some flexibility in their interpretations, and they can also add conditions to address that. Judges, if you end up having to appeal it, then judges are going to be the ones to ultimately interpret the statutes and the regulations But I think at the local level, I did want to mention, you're going to have these boards and these zoning hearing boards, and you really do need to make your voice heard. And one of the stories I wanted to tell was Elizabeth Township versus Plum Township. These are two townships just outside of Pittsburgh. And Elizabeth Township elected a whole bunch of pro-gas, pro-fracking commissioners who then changed all of the township's ordinances to be pro-fracking, pro-gas. They actually made it a permitted use in all of the zoning areas. So all the way across the township, it was allowed to do any kind of fracking infrastructure. And sure enough, it did what they wanted it to do. It attracted that infrastructure, it attracted the well companies, and they came in and they put in a ton. And it wasn't until a year, 2 years later, when they saw the negative effects of that, that they began trying to claw back some of the ordinances that they had enacted. In Plum Township, it went the opposite way. They had enacted a bunch of folks that were anti, and they enacted ordinance after ordinance that restricted the amount, that increased setbacks, that increased buffer zones, that made it more difficult, that required air studies, air pollution studies, sound studies, traffic impact studies, all of it to just throw in some roadblocks and make it more difficult. And they've had a pretty decent success of limiting the amount of infrastructure that came into their communities. But it was because the community stepped up and talked to them, was there making decisions or helping them make decisions and making their voice heard throughout the process. When do you need to take action? Now, like I said, all of those pieces, all of that, those background, the precedent, the people, the regulations, they're already in place. So you really need to start paying attention to your local governance now. You need to pay attention to the DEP and the EPA for environmental concerns, getting decision makers in place that will vote for your values, because if you don't, then you can really lose a lot. Time is of the essence. It always is. The more time that you have, the better arguments that you can make, the more time your experts will have, the more time lawyers may have to research, understand a case, and step in. And you may need to fundraise. So, we deal with situations all the time where we're getting phone calls of people saying they just passed, they just issued this permit. Say, we just can't help you now, right? It may be too late. Or there's a meeting next week. Can you represent us? I need more time, right? If you give me 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, maybe. But when it's only 1 week away, it just becomes much more difficult to lift that up. And one of there's a couple other little stories I want to share with the limited time I have here, but Churchill Future was a group that we worked with. There was a big Amazon warehouse that was going to go into their community, and they saw it immediately, and they paid attention, and they went in and they immediately started calling their local decision makers. They immediately started calling the DEP, and they put up enough of a fight that Amazon walked away. They said, it's going to be too difficult to be here. And it's really important to recognize that businesses want the path of least resistance, and they specifically look for those things. And so if you put up resistance, if you let them know that you're paying attention, if you let them know, hey, I see that your permit didn't mention all of these things, all of that starts to make them pay attention and potentially reconsider what they're doing. Set up systems. It can be really difficult to track all of these things. So we really like to work with friends groups and see friends groups that are working well to pay attention to those, local agendas that are on the Facebook pages for their municipalities, to see what's happening so that they're not missing meetings where these decisions are made. Because if those meetings happen, if a vote occurs, you can simply lose your voice ever being able to be heard on that topic, which really comes down to notice and comment, right? For almost all of the decisions that a municipality needs to make, there's going to be some form of a notice and comment period. It might be 10 minutes at the end of a regular scheduled board meeting. It might be for Clean Air Act or Clean Water Act permits, you might have 30 days, might be 60 days. Usually it's on the notice. So, but you have to be paying attention, because if you aren't, you can lose a significant amount of time. Appeals is just another thing I just like to mention, because if you don't have, if you do not appeal something, it can become permanent. Like I was mentioning before with Clean Air Act permit, Clean Water Act permits, even if it violates every rule in the Clean Air Act, if the DEP says it's okay and nobody pays attention and nobody appeals it, they can do it forever. And it becomes what's called a permit shield, and they're just allowed to do it. So you really do have to be paying attention, or you could absolutely lose your right to complain forever. So then I want to get into sort of the how do you actually give yourself the best chances, right? I'm an attorney. I've studied and I've been involved in this stuff for a long time. I've seen really good groups and some really bad groups approaching things. And so, you know, like I said, getting involved early is really important, but then what do you actually need to tell them, right? And if I am involved, I don't know Plum Township's zoning ordinance. I just know how to look through it, right? And knowing how to pay attention to it. And so making sure that you looking at the right regulations, looking all the way through it, looking through the table of contents to search for what might be relevant in this case to then bring to their attention. One of the things that I wanted to also mention, based on Matt's topic earlier about, you know, this red tape, and it really can be very difficult to navigate the red tape, but bureaucrats also just want to do their job. And if you send them something that is on the wrong form, they have to just send it back to you. They have to review it. They have to say, oh, no, this is wrong and this is wrong, and you should have done this here. And then they have to write that up and explain to you why everything that you did wasn't right, you know, or they just deny it and then they send it back and then you call. But you can often just talk to them, especially at the local level, right? They just want to help do stuff, right? And they'd rather just talk you through the process. And it can also be a really good way to make friends, make allies. They'll help to push your stuff through. They'll let you know. And so they don't have to be, in all cases, that nameless bureaucrat sitting behind a desk. You can figure out their name and talk to them and give them a call and, you know, wish them a nice weekend. And I can tell you, it goes over so much better when you are working with them to make their jobs easier, to make their lives easier. Then they're going to want to make your lives easier. And so make your bureaucrats not quite so nameless, and it'll go a long way for you. You also should know about right to know requests. They can also go a long way to helping get you the documents that you need, get you the understanding that you need of what's happening in your community, because all government levels require openness, and you can ask. And there's some process of filling out the right form and sending it to the right person. But again, you can also learn that person. And so I'm on, you know, first name basis with right to know officers at different agencies, where if I'm a little vague in my right to know request, they'll call me or they'll email me and say, Tim, what were you really trying to get here? Right? They don't want to just deny it because they know that I'm going to come back with a new one. Right? So they want to help me get what I need so that I leave them alone. And that's right to know requests can be really useful, but it's also a way to get to know the people that are in these agencies, build those relationships, which is something that I know Jason's going to talk a lot more about after I'm done here in the next few minutes. As you are going through and thinking about making a comment to your local municipality, issue spotting is the name of the game, right? It's looking through the regulations, looking through the application and asking yourself, is there a problem there? Is there a problem there? Maybe that's something. And generally, there's regulations on just about everything, right? That's what the bureaucracy is about. That's what the regulations are about. So, look into it and write them all down and let them know, right? Hey, there might be something here. And it at least puts it on the record, it at least raises that issue for them. Those comments that you're making can actually form the basis for the record that's going to carry through the rest of the, if it was to be appealed, that would carry through the rest of the litigation. And so you really need to build that record at the lowest level possible, where you can actually lose the ability to bring those arguments up later. So if you have the resources, hire a scientific expert. If you have the resources, hire a legal expert. They can look through things a little bit more and make sure that those arguments and those scientific bases make it into the potential arguments for later. And so generally, at least in my experience with the environmental law realm, legal and scientific basis is just about all that's actually going to change their mind at the state and federal level, right? You can send in 500 letters from local community members saying, we don't want this here. They're going to be looking at the regulations. They're going to be looking at the science and saying, do we have to permit this? Because they kind of have to permit it. If it's not illegal and it's not going to be harmful as far as the regulations are concerned, then they have to permit it. And so looking for legal and scientific bases are really important to do. Where do you look for those legal bases? Well, if you can't hire a lawyer, then you're going to need to look into the statutes and the regulations. So you're going to be looking at the code service for the federal statutes. There are state statutes and then local zoning codes and comprehensive plans. Regulations are in the CFR, the state administrative code, and the building codes. So that's where you're going to be looking to try and just find where might this permit be wrong. As you're going through that process, the big takeaway from this slide is just take notes. It's really easy to lose important information. You can be going through and you have an aha moment and, oh, this is the key right here. And if you don't write it down, I can guarantee it's going to take you forever to find that in a week, 2 weeks, when you go back to write down your comment. So just take notes and essentially be comprehensive with it. Just put everything that you can in. If it looks applicable, put it in your comment. It's better to mention it and preserve the argument than to just think, oh, maybe that's not good enough, and to leave it out. So if a lawyer gets involved, they can be limited to the record that was created below. You actually, be kicked out of a court case if you're trying to make an argument and nobody brought it up down below, and they say you didn't preserve that, and just that can be the end of the case right there. I lost a Pennsylvania Supreme Court case on that. I thought it was a really good argument. It was a really good argument. They told me it was a really good argument, but it wasn't brought up down below before I got involved. So that can happen. So really, the key takeaway that I like to take away is bureaucracy it's difficult, it's complex, but it is able to be figured out, right? You can dive in and figure out the pieces, and if you make friends along the way, then that process will be even easier, right? Whether that's friends with folks that have been through it before, whether it's friends with folks that are in these agencies, friends with the folks that are in the municipalities, all of those relationships are going to go a long, long way towards getting to your goal at the end of the day. So we're going to save the questions for later. So I'm just going to skip over that, and I will pass it over to Jason. Unless anybody has any particular questions for me at the moment.
Thank you, Tim.
Yep.
And I think I'm on screen. I hope I'm on screen. I'm not seeing myself. So I really liked what you said there. There's a couple things that I was doing and some research and a couple quotes that were really kind of stood out. If you imagine this bureaucracy being this, as Max Weber put it, this sort of division of labor, right? You're just simply a cog in this wheel, right? And you only, if the bureaucrat only sees themselves as that mere component, right? They only become a portion of their occupation, this cold, nameless face, this impersonality that Weber had also talked about. And it's risky, it's dangerous. These are human beings, right? That have emotions as well. And you can use that humanizing to your advantage if you act human towards them. And I really appreciate you saying that. And again, it can happen quickly when you get in, when people work for these big, massive corporations or governments, and their purposes start to become diminished, right? And what Weber says is, they wanted impersonality, but it takes away, it dehumanizes, and rules replace purpose and become the measure of the official self-worth. But you can turn that on our heads, and you can treat people with listen to them, because Weber also said that these bureaucrats were supposed to be the most intelligent, top of their field people overseeing these decisions, right? And give them credit for that. Like you said, they want to see things get done. And since since bureaucrats are human, humans make mistakes, and some humans like things better than others, and they may decide to enforce one rule more than another. And you can get a feeling for that as well. Now, ultimately, they have a measurable standard, and that's good, and you can always pull the rule milk out when you need it, but you can also play on that human emotion of them as well. So great information. And Jason, the screen is all yours. So Jason with Cannabiz Media is going to share some of his experiences working through the bureaucratic system in a very up and coming and budding industry.
That's right. I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody see it now?
Yes, thank you,
Okay.
Jason.
Good,
Yes.
great. Thank you. All right, as we jump in, I want to make sure you can see this this photo here. I took this about 7 years ago when I was doing my graduate work out in Pueblo, Colorado. Frequently, when we talk about cannabis legalization, one of the big buzzwords is freedom, freedom to engage in business and consume a plant. And this is the nexus of that freedom when the giant cameras of government and compliance are looming in the horizon over that freedom in the mountains of Colorado. So something to keep in mind, just a perspective as we go through this evening. Just a quick setting of the scope for my discussion. It's going to be in two parts. One will be kind of how I got into the industry, and definitely ties in with bureaucracy very well. My graduate research, I was a community and regional planning master's student at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. I ended up completing my thesis, looking at the industry and the relationship between Colorado's recent adult use legalization, forming their first more organized cannabis market, land use controls, and water regulation. That was a relatively unstudied area at the time, and I think water availability is certainly much more at the heart of every development and land use consideration, particularly in the Western United States, but even more so around here. And if it's not water quantity, it's water quality. So my title was New Land Use and Water Policy Geographies in Emerging Cannabis Markets. the case of Pueblo County. Later in my discussion, I'll talk about my current work at Cannabiz Media. Just had my 6th anniversary with the company. I'm currently the director of regulatory research. Cannabiz Media is known as the industry's database of record. We combine government data, including license holder contact and operational data, in addition to a business intelligence platform. Our clients are not limited to the space. We have a lot of financial, banking, and investment companies utilizing our product. And we're primarily used for license validation, in addition to marketing, lead generation, email marketing, and sales data. This is one of my favorite photos, another one. So Matt previously talked about the faceless bureaucrat. Down below on the right, he now no longer has eyes. It's kind of the next evolution. So thinking generally from prohibition and prohibitionist politics and frameworks where cannabis was completely prohibited, to modern regulatory frameworks. Again, this picture cracks me up. This was just to give you some context. This was a lottery process to award dispensary licenses through the Rhode Island Department of Business Regulation. So the bureaucrat was selecting lottery balls that corresponded to applicant numbers for a lottery-based process, as opposed to a merit-based process or an unlimited number of licenses, as some states have had. We'll touch upon that. So just a little bit of background and timeline, going back all the way to the mid-1990s, some voter and activist groups approved medical cannabis programs. It wasn't nationwide. I think California came first. And between 1995 or 1996 and 2010, there were probably about a dozen, usually through voter approved, either a constitutional amendment or a statutory ballot measure that created some kind of medical cannabis program. I don't want to call it a formal market. A lot of these were very informal. They relied on a system of collaborative programs, collectives, and nonprofits to avoid business and tax scrutiny. Again, another bureaucratic and regulatory angle. Starting in the 2010s, a little over 10 years ago, we started to see some of the adult use recreational legalization attempts start to pass. And alongside it, some hemp programs were established, which gave rise to CBD, which if you're in Pennsylvania, CBD seems to be everywhere, including the gas station. 2012, Colorado and Washington came first. 2014, Alaska and Oregon came second. It's interesting to note, those dates, those were the dates of the election in which that measure passed. But Colorado and Washington took about 2 years, and Alaska and Oregon took about another 2 years. So it wasn't until 2014 for the first few states, and 2015 into 2016 for that second group of states to really get up and running. And it's important to keep in mind that bureaucracies take time to develop, and this is something that was voter initiated. A lot of state officials were not ready for this kind of thinking. It was very difficult to get further legislation worked on and passed in some of these states, just to prop up markets and licensing and various rulemaking. So it could take 2 years. After 2014, kind of up through now, there's just been an ongoing expansion of medical and adult use markets. Various states have added either new medical programs. Since a lot of us are in Pennsylvania, using Pennsylvania as a great example, our legislature passed our medical cannabis program bill in 2016, but it took nearly 18 months getting into 2018 for the first sales to launch. Similar timeline happened in neighboring Maryland, West Virginia, and Ohio. Of course, I know there's an audience member in New Mexico I think that program was around for about 13 years for medical before moving into adult use earlier this year. Another important timeline note is 2018. So cannabis in Canada became federally legal. Provincial sales launched in the fall, and later in fall of 2018, the US Farm Bill established a regulatory system for the regulation of industrial hemp, which does fit into this. More farmers are probably engaged with hemp than are involved with psychoactive cannabis. And it's important to keep in mind, I know Meagan referenced the onion analogy. In the world of cannabis in the United States, that federal onion layer is somewhere between very thin or completely non-existent. There's IRS concerns, FDA concerns, but everything is really going on within each state. So it's very hard for operators to normalize their operations when they're doing things 30 or 50 different ways with all the different state regulators. For me, jumping into the academic study of cannabis regulations started in the summer of 2015. At the same time, there were two different articles that I caught in midsummer. The American Planning Association magazine called Planning had an article in their summer issue on the rollout of programs and the planning implications. It talked about Colorado, a little bit on Washington, and some other states that were coming on board at the same time. I saw that High Country News also had an article on Pueblo County, Colorado, entitled The Silicon Valley of Marijuana. They still have that nickname to this date. And I believe it was the Planning magazine article identified the county's planning director. I reached out to her. I had a few questions about the challenging and dynamic planning landscape. And before I knew it, I was invited up for a visit to tour the county. So, some places have governments with debt or just very challenging finances. Early days in Colorado, they had the money for some complete unknown stranger, a grad student from the state to the south, to come on Colorado and stay at a hotel for a couple nights, tour the industry, get introduced to everybody. Definitely a unique scenario for a grad student and for a planner. Now, looking just kind of nationwide at this, zoning is always the one that really sticks out as a challenging, contentious point. So I wanted to include just a couple recent articles before we continue pushing forward. Just various headlines from around the country. I think a lot of these are more focused from New England, where there's a big rec rollout going on right now. But you see 3 of these are specifically about zoning. And then one of them, the Hastings article on the bottom right, is about a 6-month moratorium, which is another regulatory tool available, just delaying sales and licensing. And then finally, from Rhode Island in the middle, town votes on just straight permitting or banning operations and facilities. It's more of a licensing question. So these are some of the political questions and considerations that we're going to be thinking about and going through in this presentation tonight. Again, as Matt mentioned, Max Weber's bureaucracy theory. Prime example here, voter or legislature approved legalization really is the first step. If the voters are approving it and the legislation is not so interested in enacting it, that's really forcing them through the door into getting moving. So election night or the ballot board counting the votes and the certification process, it's kind of that first domino. But decision making is going to fall on a variety of actors moving forward. The state legislature, usually tasked first. Regulatory commissions, panels, and other agencies are either established or sometimes hijacked and charged with also dealing with cannabis. Some examples would include state alcohol commissions might be tapped into for their resources and knowledge on dealing with something similar. Sometimes it's a health department, business regulation agency, or sometimes there's just a new commission established from the ground up. Other actors down the line include day-to-day staffers, possible county or municipal officials, and also utility folks as well. So again, after legalization, there is that four-step, forming, storming, norming, and performing process. And that could happen in a very short time. Some of these states, I believe Oklahoma was a record, they did it in about 3 months from the medical cannabis initiative being approved to licenses being awarded, and cultivation was in the ground, 3.5 months later. Other states have taken over 2 years or even 4 years. And in West Virginia, they took a little bit longer. But again, that transition from prohibition to newly established bureaucracy, the storming phase could be very chaotic for some of these states. And of course, there's the law of unintended consequences. Other anticipated and unforeseen concerns pop up along the way. So either during the election, frequent concern during the election, I don't want a dispensary in my neighborhood. I don't want to grow in my neighborhood. I'm worried about odor. I'm worried about, in the case of this screenshot, being hash bill being incredibly flammable. I don't want the cannabis extraction lab in my neighborhood blowing up the neighborhood. Various locally unwanted land use concerns. Fire safety is a big one, but also security concerns. Are these facilities going to be a target for robberies? This is still a cash-only business nationwide. Is the dispensary next to my restaurant or business going to be robbed? Is somebody going to be cutting through my business to go through the wall and break in and take product? So these were some of the concerns that came up, as the rulemaking was proceeding in a lot of these states. Various task forces and working groups have been established all over the country. Some of the statutory pre-market launch some of these concerns, and thinking about the onion, federal fixes are going to be required for a lot of these concerns. And again, there might be a short timeline. Some of these programs have been mandated. Hey, we're going to get this going in 3 months, 6 months, 8 months. There might be a lot of loopholes, challenges, appeals, fights, things that end up delaying for many years or for many months. Handful of states are navigating that right now. Now, think about where legalization meets bureaucracy. People are establishing new businesses, and it's a variety of government operators and regulators and bureaucrats have concerns that need to be alleviated. So multidisciplinary concerns in the case of cannabis have yielded an incredibly complex regulatory environment. In addition to state and local cannabis licensing, which is mandatory in all of the states of the market, there are a variety of other considerations, either checklists, sign-offs, hearings, appeals, panel approvals, you name it, depending on the local and state context. Just to start, jumping back to the top, state cannabis licenses are typically broken down into a few categories. Production would include cultivation and manufacturing. Some states break down cultivation even further into many licenses for one location. There are some regulators that require maybe one license for every 1,000 plants, or one license for every 2,500 square feet or 5,000 square feet. So you might be applying for multiple licenses at the same time. Manufacturing also falls into the production category. That includes extractions and other processes that would turn plant and whole flower into ready to sell, ready to consume, ready to distribute cannabis products. Transportation is the second category. Distribution is not something that's prevalent in every state. I think in terms of a bureaucratic process, this might run into federal concerns, including the Department of Transportation. There are some additional risks that aren't always present with some of the other activities and license types. Quality control and scientific research, the third category. At this point in 2022, almost every state requires product testing through state certified and ISO certified labs. As far as the kind of historic legacy medical cannabis states, some states did have programs, and groups of state regulators got together to talk to each other and develop cohesive kind of nationwide regulations that have kind of laid the groundwork for federal movement in the future. But now they've been implemented by almost every state. Finally, sales is the fourth category, including dispensary and retail licenses, delivery, which is available in some markets, and also consumption. So looking at the broad categories here really shows the variety of regulators and stakeholders that might be interested in having some level of sign off before you take your operation and make it up and running, get it up and running. Then the last one, I didn't include it as a category, but micro businesses are a smaller but stacked up version of a vertically integrated. Typically it's cultivation, manufacturing, and dispensary, sometimes also delivery. These are most common in California and New Mexico at this point. In addition to that, what I ran into in Pueblo, Colorado was the county government's interest in getting a county business license, but also validation from a variety of stakeholders, just depending on your geography within the county. So land use, although it seemed like it was the most complicated, depending on where you were, could have been the easiest. You just had to demonstrate that your zoning was compliant and that you weren't too close to other cannabis businesses or sensitive land uses, including houses of worship, schools, daycare centers, other related, more sensitive land uses. Fire safety sign off from the fire marshal was another major one. At the time, I think there were concerns over hash explosions. Again, that was between 2014 and 2016, there were more of those. And of course, water regulation was one of the bigger ones. Your physical geography and your community context really influenced by who your water provider was, or who your water provider is. If you're in a neighborhood where there's an irrigation district or a well regulator, or the state is charged with ensuring safe and equitable access to surface water diversions, your sign off varies. That approval and that process, it could take days, it could take minutes, it could take months. There are also city water regulators through the water authority, state water regulators, and then of course this is Colorado, very, very different than our own local context in Western PA. They use a different system for allocating water rights. There are people who own water rights in other parts of the state, and they're able to just sell you water, hauled water. You just go take a truck, fill your truck up, get a big tank, and unload your tank at the cultivation facility, and that water would be safe to use. Other sign-offs include sewage, health department approval, notably for edibles, concentrates, and also county and state tax authorities. So by the end of the day, you have a massive packet with everything, and that's just to get the local approval before the state approval comes through later. Just to put this in a simplified timeline, this is not tied to any one regulatory environment. But in general, you're selecting your site, you're working on at least partial capital raises, and then at the same time, you're developing your site and working on the licensing process. Then you're finally able to launch. There are a couple states where they want to see you built out before they will issue you your final license. That's led to some challenges and problems where you're fighting your local or state bureaucrat, and they're telling you, they're pushing back. You got to speed up, you got to finish, or you have a limited amount of time before you're able to either get your license, or you may risk losing your chance at a license. But the challenge that really stood on top of all of this is it's legalization, it's land use, and it's a semi-arid environment. So drought and energy concerns were a huge point of discussion. As I sat down, I interviewed water regulators, government regulators, and cultivators. The availability of water, not so much the quantity, but also the legality of the water source, was probably the biggest sticking point. This is an example of bureaucracy, I don't want to say running amok, but possibly straying down additional paths and unforeseen risks and consequences. Back in 2014, the US Bureau of Reclamation, which mainly regulates water and inland water sources in the Western United States, they were reviewing the legalization efforts, bringing cannabis markets up and running in Colorado and Washington state. Attorneys at Reclamation decided that Reclamation was an agency charged with enforcing Schedule 1, which is typically left to the DEA and more traditional police agencies. This is Schedule 1 is the drug schedule, but the government has determined cannabis has no medicinal value. It's not legal for consumption in any way, shape, or form. So here you have a water regulator deciding, well, we're going to enforce Schedule 1. And if you're a grower and you're using our water for your cultivation, that's illegal. So this kind of added another layer, and we're putting onion layers back on them. Added another layer of complexity where the government had to get involved and the water regulators had to come together, and the growers needed to know, where's my water coming from? Is it legal water? Is it illegal water? The concept of water commingling. This is a 50-gallon bucket. 25 gallons are from the US Reclamation. The other 25 are from state and local sources and other water rights. On an annual basis, only 25 gallons of that water can be allocated to cannabis uses in that basin, in that bucket, for that example. So that added an incredibly just complex layer and a nightmare for some of these growers. People ended up getting into a contentious geopolitical exercise. One guy got into the industry because he owned water and he knew there was value in selling the water to others. Another guy went and purchased 2,000 acre feet of water in a different basin across the state to compete with the city water authority because the city wouldn't provide water to outdoor cultivators. So a lot of just bizarre politics. And I think the year I was out there doing this research, there was no drought going on. So this could be pretty ugly in a drought season. So again, legality and water quantity are two things, but irrigation and ag tech, promoting responsible site development and upgrading, that tends to be a community conversation, but also renewable energy promotion to reduce water waste and energy waste. Beyond that, cultivator and other restrictions, again, just the use of the water, deciding there's an irrigation season, although water is defined as it's an industrial use of water if it's indoors and an agricultural use if it's outdoors. So you have people with multiple, mixed facility operations losing some of their water come November 1st or gaining more on May 1st. just a bizarre calendar. And then finally, you have a major just conflict between profit motive, a new or upstart business, people who want to do right for the planet, but also are navigating unbelievably complex regulations, licensing restrictions, regulators that could knock on your door at 2 a.m. and do an unannounced site visit, things like that. Thinking about these reflections from the regulators and conversations that I had. Thinking back to step one, when the legislation for legalization is approved by the voters, that's the first step. But that step had plenty of history and context on things that predated it. Biggest thing that came to mind as I was working on this presentation is comprehensive plans. There are land use officials, community officials, local leaders, maybe in your community right now, who are thinking about what will our town look like in 10 or 15 years? What are we going to look like in 2040? Nobody's thinking about a major ballot measure that's going to upend agriculture and land use in your state. That's kind of out of the box thinking, and this is kind of a once in a lifetime, once in a generation challenge for government. But the question that I thought up is, are comprehensive plans comprehensive enough if some major outside force comes swinging in like a pendulum, establishing a business licensing system for something that was illegal 10 years ago or today? So it's just something to keep in mind when you think about the future and you think about comprehensive planning and other things that might come up that are outside of the scope of the comprehensive planning process. So given all that, modifications to zoning and land use controls might be necessary to accommodate new industry. Now, the bureaucratic nightmare of a planned unit development, and this is not limited to just cannabis, anybody interested in developing sustainable community neighborhoods, community development, walkable mixed use landscapes, you might run into a PUD, a planned unit development, when working with zoning officials. So I pulled up a little bit more detail from my research, and I had to look back because it's been a few years, but there were developers that had cultivation sites or were working with cultivators and wanted to add marijuana infused product. Those are manufacturing locations. They wanted to add that license to parcels on agriculturally zoned A1, A2 zoning districts. Extraction and other license types and activity types are distinct land uses and are not typically approved for agricultural areas. A lot of folks were required to apply to rezone the property under a planned unit development. This is sometimes referred to as spot zoning, by the way. As land use regulation focuses on ensuring safety, and the PUD allows for more flexible, responsive land use control, reacting to special circumstances. This rezone was most commonly used to apply for extraction and cultivation on the same property in the same zone. This also helped streamline security controls, so you didn't have to worry about product being transported from one site to another. Now, looking back, again, I have, starting in this table from the year 2001. 2001 to 2011, this was a very infrequent, underutilized tool. This isn't exactly the sexiest land use discussion on planned unit development. We can be honest about that. But starting in 2012, the year that cannabis was permitted and legalized in Colorado, now there was one PUD that was most likely a result of a medical marijuana business, because 2013 the rules started. So, looking at 2013, 14, 15, over half of the planned unit developments were in response to people navigating the bureaucratic system to streamline cannabis developments, cannabis businesses. 9 out of 10 in 2014 pretty unbelievable. You know, that number 10, that could have been a mixed use development, you know, office and retail and residential. But the majority of these, it was cannabis cultivation, manufacturing, maybe even retail on site. A lot of unintended consequences here. Jumping on to further regulator reflections. Biggest concern from all of the regulator types I interacted with was the availability and the usability of water. They were all willing to collaborate with one another. They all had each other on speed dial. You know, I was in each of their offices. They had their phone numbers present. You know, they're calling each other up. They're operating in a larger context. There is a bureaucratic context that sometimes is unseen, that kind of encompasses a whole geographic area. And these folks do engage with each other. Again, note on irrigation season, that was another big concern and takeaway from growers and water operators, noting the limitations on the irrigation calendar, but also communication issues. Jumping over to operator reflections, these folks all navigated the bureaucracy from start to finish, and they all mentioned that this is not a process that has a finish line. You know, you walk out the door with your license in hand, but local officials can still come in and check up on you. So the folks that I interacted with, it was a variety of operators. They all had cultivation. That was the only baseline requirement of my study. Some of them had stores, some of them had manufacturing. I think one of them was only a grower. They were in different parts of the community. They had different experiences getting their land use approval. And some of them had, again, varying challenges with water sourcing and operational issues, but they all really hammered away at the importance of human relationships. And that's been a theme this evening in all of our presentations. You know, your regulator, they're not there to be your best friend, but they are a partner, and they are there to help the community thrive and help ensure safety and health. But they're also there to sometimes help you out a little bit. Thinking back to my first visit to the community, it was more of a just assessing what was going on there. The county planning director gave me a tour of the county, took me to all the different facilities that she had in mind. She said, I'm going to introduce you to a few growers. Took like half of a Saturday to drive me around. She stopped and picked up a dozen donuts for one of the growers. She said, Sean loves this donut place. So, you know, you never know. You're working with bureaucrats who establish a good relationship. One day they might be bringing you and your organization a dozen donuts. And I think that'd be pretty sweet as an added bonus. Pivoting over to my current work at Cannabiz Media, our company tracks over 52,000 active and pending cannabis licenses, thousands more on the hemp industry as well. We're linking together companies and contacts, so that includes the people that own and operate these businesses with their entities. And there are some companies that are operating in 30 states or 20 states or, you know, 5 to 10 countries. We are keeping up on this data and verifying and validating all of these 52,000 licenses and applications on a monthly basis for our clients. This also includes news and analysis, violations, those who run afoul of the law and are in a bureaucratic nightmare, frequently of their own making, product and health and safety recalls, and also regulatory insights. In the course of my day-to-day, I'm routinely interacting with over 150 government operators and regulators in almost every state, every Canadian province, and nearly every continent. So various types of just cultural nuance and work styles. Again, as I talked about in the first half of my presentation, the license types that we monitor, the different activities include cultivation, manufacturing, distribution, micro business, testing and research, and then the sales subcategory, including dispensary, retailer, delivery, and more recently, consumption lounges. Keep an eye out for those if you're going to be in Vegas in the next 6 months or so. In my work with Cannabiz Media, navigating bureaucracy includes routine communication with all of these regulators. I've developed relationships with some of the head regulator, the director, executive director of commissions, various panels, various office staff. And it's important to keep in mind when you're working on any kind of project, there's a good chance you're going to be engaging more with professional staff if it's before 5 o'clock. And if you're at a meeting in the evening, it'll be more likely to be either a political appointee or an elected official. There are varying differences in communication and effectiveness, depending on who you're communicating with. Sometimes reaching out to the chair of a commission is not nearly as likely to be successful as if you're reaching out to the head secretary, who might have a lot of background and a lot of knowledge that's very important and relevant to your case, your application, and the case you're trying to make to get approval. And a lot of these are repeat inquiries. So we're interacting with the same people for months and months or years. There are challenges to that. There's a variation in workflows, processes, and office culture all over the country. We really do try to take advantage of open data versus filing another FOIA request, another email. We do have a limited number of companies that do similar work, possible competitors, but the robust inquiry and FOIA system that we've found ourselves surrounded by and that we've developed has really helped us stand out as a leader. Not only do these states recognize us when we make a request, but our clients know that we're going to have up-to-date data. So developing that relationship is very important. To date, it's almost October. I have a colleague who does a lot of the government outreach himself. He's probably submitted well over 200 at this point, just various Freedom of Information Act and public records requests nationwide. And I've probably submitted another 50 just informal inquiries to various government regulators and bureaucrats all over the place, getting updates and quick answers on things. So we're continuously trying to establish a direct line of communication to ensure just rapid, thorough, and fair answers and fact-finding completion. So in turn and in summary, I'd like to just wrap this up. My biggest takeaways, regardless of your perspective and your pathway you're hoping to go down and finish, biggest one is do your homework. Before you go in, you have to research the relevant websites to find various applications, forms, and processes in advance of starting. You might find a completed application, especially on an open data website. You might find an example of a 300 or 500 page application or a 2-page application that somebody else submitted, doing what you're trying to do. And you can find a good example of maybe meeting minutes could back this up as well, finding that somebody else did something similar to what you're proposing and they hit green lights every step of the way. They didn't run into having their request get tabled, getting denied, having to start over. So you might be able to find a lot of help just by doing your homework on a government website. FAQs help as well. And on top of that, remember that public records are your friend. You're legally entitled to government transparency to some degree, and you can submit requests for communications, emails, other applications, any kind of insights or other data that you need that might help you make your case for your project. Knowing your audience is another major big takeaway here. Again, knowing the regulator type or the leader you'll be interacting with. Just be very aware in how you're framing your questions and inquiries to ensure successful responses, but also a complete response. It's kind of like a garbage in, garbage out. If you send them a bad request, they may just use that as an example and a reason to throw out your inquiry and not answer you at all. Otherwise, elected commissioners are most likely working on a volunteer or largely unpaid basis, and they have limited time. So don't take your inquiry to them on the first try. Definitely find that day-to-day staffer, as Meagan identified in her hierarchy of top-down, municipal leadership. That's very helpful. You find a day-to-day staffer, they're going to have valuable institutional knowledge, and they're probably going to be willing to offer unofficial guidance. This board, this panel, they're really receptive to stormwater mitigation. They're really receptive to community gardens. You might walk away with a lot of insights from the folks that sift through a lot of these files and applications all day. And you might get some success stories, other warnings, or even pitfalls and risks that might challenge the way you were thinking about your project and send you back to the drawing board briefly. In addition to knowing your audience, taking advantage of opportunities to provide constructive feedback. If your meeting goes well or your public hearing goes well, make sure you thank the panel. Definitely wait till after you have an approval, but if there's any kind of survey or opportunity to provide feedback or just a public comment forum at a meeting, commissioners and people that run community-oriented processes really need to be soliciting feedback to improve the process at the end of the process. That's an opportunity for you to run through and share your concerns about your application, it could be a cannabis application, it really could be anything, doesn't matter. There's usually a space to provide good feedback, and that, as voters, as stakeholders, that's our opportunity to keep government moving in the right direction in the long term. And I think overall, and this is a big theme that we've all talked about tonight, is just to keep in mind the value of human relationships. Again, not everybody tonight is going to get donuts from a government bureaucrat, although I wish you do. But just keeping in mind that these are people, they have families, they live in your neighborhoods. Bureaucrats aren't there to screw you over and hurt you. But they do have a job. They're charged with completing and ensuring health and safety is usually at the heart of it, regardless of what it is. And, you don't want to burn your bridges, but keep in mind that the relationships you're building might help you on a future project. They might help the bureaucrat or the regulator you're working with. And it's part of building good community. So that's everything I've got. I'd like to thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Jason. I apologize for having to turn your video off. We were having some buffering issues earlier, but it seemed to resolve the issue. So I thank you so much for sharing some of those stories and your experiences working with the many in the marijuana industry throughout the U.S. and the world, really. So I wanted to make everyone aware tonight that this, as well as our earlier pre-development or our sustainable development workshops, are being recorded and are stored on Downstream Strategies channel. And we will put that link in the chat if you want to click that and view some of our earlier iterations and episodes. As I said, tonight's workshop was part of a series of sustainable development workshops. Our next one is scheduled for November 29th and will be our final in the series. And its topic will be managing construction projects. So we have scaled yet another pitch in this Summit to Sustainability. And I thank you all for being a part of tonight. As I said, I'm going to attach the link in the chat box. And Brennan will submit or also paste a link for taking a survey. And as Jason mentioned earlier during his presentation, we want your feedback. It goes for making better, a better product for you. And really that is in a nutshell kind of what bureaucracy is. And bureaucracy will always exist in the pursuit of making things better. So we hope you take part in this bureaucratic exercise and fill out our survey, and we hope to see you next time. So Brennan, if you want to paste that in there, I will also paste the link to our YouTube channel. So please fill out, click on the link while it's still active. And I appreciate you all tonight, and have a good one, and see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody. Have a great night.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thanks, guys.